Hello, YouTube. My name is Mike Frost. I'd like to welcome you to the Postmodern Poetry Prognosticator Booktube site, a title not even I can take seriously. But I thought I would start with the newbie Booktube tag. So it would be a great place to start. But as I understand it, this idea of the tag is to get to know the YouTuber a little bit better, not necessarily the site or the types of videos he's going to do. So I'll do a separate YouTube video for an introduction to the site. So I'll use this newbie tag to introduce myself to YouTube, because I admire so many other booktubers that I thought I would introduce myself this year. So the newbie tag has 10 questions. I'm going to take them slightly out of order because I think it works better slightly out of order. But the first question is, why do you start the channel? I started because I admire so many of the booktubers. I've been watching so many of the booktubers. I've been following a lot of the booktubers. I enjoy speaking about books. I read a tremendous amount of books and have few people that I can discuss them with. So to have the conversation, to be a part of this conversation, I think would be a wonderful thing. So I'm going to try to be an active part of the conversation in my own way. Second question is, what are some of the unique or fun things I can bring to the YouTube? I'm neither fun nor unique, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I hope to bring some perspective of my own to some of the books that I will review. As the title of the site would indicate, I'm primarily going to focus on poetry, postmodern poetry. And in the introduction to this channel, I'll explain that I don't really think of postmodern as an era. It's just we're no longer postmodern. So we're post that. We don't really have a good name because of the problems with the name of postmodern, which if you look at the introduction to the website, I'll get into further. But if I can do one thing, I speak of the poetry that I read. So I'm going to try to focus mainly on poetry, but for the other booktubers that do tags, I read a lot of books outside of the poetry world. But for my site, for my videos, I will stick with poetry. What are you most excited about is being a part of the conversation. I've not been active online. I follow people online, but I've not been an active communicator. So I would be fascinated to be a part of the conversation. It's very varied conversation that goes on in this booktube world, and I'd like to be a small part of that. Some of the other questions, like why do you read, and what book or series got you into reading, and when did you start reading? I'm going to hold on to that one for those three questions and skip to another question. What questions would you ask your favorite booktubers? I guess since I'm going to focus on poetry in my videos, I would ask, what kind of poetry have you read in the past? And do you enjoy poetry? So that we could maybe talk a little bit about that and have a conversation along those lines. What challenges do I find in doing this? Like many YouTubers, I am an introvert, so this is outside my comfort zone to begin with, but I'm not a closet crazy introvert. I can speak in public, so I don't really see a challenge with that. So there's not a whole lot of challenges. I'm too old to worry about challenges at my age. Just do things and see what happens, see what comes out of it. Where do I read, and what do I like to read? I like to read poetry primarily, books about poetry, biographies about poets, but I also read a wide variety of things. And I read everywhere, anywhere. If I stop for 3 minutes anywhere, in a line, in passenger seat of a car, not driving, in my office, if I sit down, and I'm going to be starting to read wherever I am. And sometimes when I'm standing up, if I'm not going anywhere in particular, I will start reading. I carry a book with me everywhere I go. Have since I was 18. It hasn't changed. I read everywhere. So the questions now, go back to the questions that started at 3. Why do I love reading, and what book or series got me into reading, and when did you start reading? Now here I probably differ a little bit from most of the YouTubers here. I was not a child reader. I did not start reading as a child. I was not encouraged to read, and I had difficulties with learning. I had some learning challenges as a child. In the 4th grade, I remember being put in a remedial reading class, and that stayed with me through high school. I had an extremely difficult time focusing, paying attention in those years. I have a son who's been diagnosed with ADD, and I recognize a lot of the things in him that I recognize in myself as a child. So it was undiagnosed at my generation, but I really had a difficult time focusing, and I fell behind reading along with every other subject in school. So I was not a good student in elementary school, middle school, high school. I didn't come into my own until much later, but reading had a lot to do with that. And it did have one extraordinary year in the 7th grade with a teacher named Mr. Giannotis. Mr. G, everybody called him. He was a first-generation immigrant from Greece, and he was an English teacher. And the way he taught English, grammar, and literature, so he would take a Greek myth and he would tell the story. And he was an amazing storyteller. It's a gorgeous storyteller. And he would tell the story, and then he would, if he were talking about literature, he would break it down into characters and plot and themes after he would tell the story. If he was talking about grammar, he would take any sentence that he was saying in there, and he would break it down into subjects and predicates and subject nouns and predicate verbs and prepositional phrases, whatever. He'd just break it down. But it would start with the story, and I could remember all of those stories from 7th grade. I can remember to this day, Mr. G noticed that wonderful voice in which he would tell the stories and then break those stories down. And I didn't know it then, but I could learn from him. It was the one opportunity I had to learn, but I was so far behind, and I was such a bad student that I was not really there. But he caught my attention anytime he told a story. And I remember very distinctly to this day, I was sitting in my small chair there in the 7th grade, staring out the window, and outside the window there was the playground, and then beyond that was a small clump of trees, not a large clump of trees, but a small clump of trees. And I used to always just stare out the windows at those trees and daydream my way through class, as I did through most of my adolescence. And I remember one day I was looking out that window, staring at that clump of trees, and then I heard the voice of Mr. G. And he began reciting a poem from Robert Frost, Unto My Own. I didn't know Robert Frost at the time, even though we share the same last name and we're both New Englanders. But he just started reciting Unto My Own. And as I stood there looking out at the clump of trees, I remember Mr. G noticed his voice ringing when he said, one of my wishes is that those dark trees, so old and firm they scarcely show the breeze, were not as the merest mask of gloom, but stretched away into the edge of doom. I should not be withheld, but that someday into their vastness I should steal away, fearless of ever finding open land or highway where the slow wheel pours the sand. I do not see why I should ever turn back, or those that set out upon my tracks should miss me here and long to know if I still held them dear. They would not find me changed from him they knew, only more sure of all I thought I knew. that poem stayed with me my entire life. Mr. G's voice never left me. I could always hear his Greek stories, his Greek tales, but that poem by Robert Frost stayed with me. One of the few things in school or elsewhere that reached inside and stayed there in me. It did not change me as a student. I still was struggling, made it to high school, managed to get into a work program where I went to school half the day and to work the other half the day, worked full-time through high school and we never got beyond the basics in that work program. It was a program basically to keep people from dropping out. Kids like me, the at-risk kids is what they call us. But I did manage to get enough education to get myself into the military. I joined the military as a military police officer. And I got overseas. And wouldn't you know, I got stationed in what is now modern-day Turkey. Wonderful place. And where I was stationed, I was surrounded by the old Greek ruins everywhere. Ephesus, Bergamo, where Troy is now, or was then, sorry. And then I met a man named Steve Sweeney, Staff Sergeant Steve Sweeney. He was my first supervisor in the Air Force, and he was an avid chess player. But chess, remember, to me at least, was an intellectual game. It was not something that I would have any capacity for. But Steve Sweeney, God bless him, believed in me. And he started trying to teach me chess. And I couldn't get it. I just wasn't there. Just couldn't get it. He tried a million different ways. He approached it, and he was one of the most intelligent teachers I've ever had. When he could not get to me one way, he would switch and try it a different way, instead of just being one-dimensional and just the way he taught. And he stumbled upon something by giving me a book. Now, this is where we get to what started this whole thing. This book he gave me. It's a book on chess. But what it did was took a series of chess games and changed it into the story of the chess game. And the story reached me. And in doing so, he showed me that the way that I learn is through stories. It's the way that gets into me, and I'm able to comprehend things. So you take something that is not story-based, chess, the game of chess, change it into a story, and I'm able to play it, and play it well. This book and Staff Sergeant Steve Sweeney changed my life. He brought back all the memories of Mr. G, and then I realized why I would remember all of those stories he would tell when I would forget everything else and daydream through everything else. This book showed me how I learned. That's the book that started it all, because the very next book I picked up with Edith Hamilton's mythology, because I wanted to read all the stories that Mr. G told me. And I was within a short driving distance in what is now modern-day Turkey to Troy, into Ephesus, into places where they say that Homer came, Homer, if he was a one individual, but where it was consolidated, the stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, all take place in a large portion in what is now modern-day Turkey. So I got Edith Hamilton's mythology because I wanted to follow Mr. G and Otis. And in this thing, any page, you can just flip open any page, she would tell the story, but she would use poetry to illustrate, and she would quote some of the great masters of poetry, their rendition of these old Greek myths. So I was exposed to poetry at the same time that I was exposed to the story. And that's what put me on the dual road of reading. And from that point on, I started going to college and then university with the help of the military. I was on the dean's list, got a university degree, all personal accomplishments, nothing to be braggadocious about, but personal accomplishments that would have never been within my scope of beliefs a few years earlier had it not been for somebody discovering that it was through stories that I learned. So it's through these things and why I read, and what I like to read. What I would like to understand here also is I did read for escapism. A lot of the stuff I read was for escapism. But as a child, when you have an inability to focus and you're daydreaming all the time, you're in your own head a lot. And when you have no self-esteem and no self-confidence, that's not a pleasant place to be. And you start thinking that everybody thinks of you and of the world the way you do. And that can be counterproductive. And what I've found by reading, especially poetry is especially good at this, but all books, all literature, and nonfiction do this well. They take you out of your own thinking, out of your own head, and expose you to the thinking of others. And you get to understand that there is more to this world. There are other ways of thinking other than what you've put in your own head and absorbed. And we all tend to absorb the negative more than the positive. But that's one of the reasons I keep reading. And it's why I read such a diverse amount of authors. I don't try to just read those that are going to reflect my own thinking. I want to find other ways of thinking. So I hope in my website and in this conversation with you that we can expose each other to different ways of thinking, broaden our own horizons. And that's why I've joined the conversation. And I hope you will join with me in conversation. Thank you for your time.